Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our webinar on Canadian federal procurement, which we're calling Beyond the Fundamentals. We're pleased to welcome you all to this inaugural webinar series on opportunities and strategies for U.S. companies interested in selling to the Canadian government. The webinar series is brought to you in conjunction with our partners at Rhode Island Commerce, New Hampshire Aerospace Defense Export Consortium, and State of New Hampshire Business and Economic Affairs. My name is Neil Kravitz. I'm a partner at Fasken in our M&A and corporate finance group, and I'm the co-leader of our cross-border US practice. Introducing the panelists for today, Marcia is co-lead of Fasken's National Security Group and counsel to Fasken's Procurement, International Trade, and Customs and Technology, Media and Telecommunications groups. Before joining Fasken, Marcia worked in both the public and private sector as external and in-house counsel in defense, aerospace, and security and information technology. Most recently, as counsel to Public Services and Procurement Canada, central purchasing agent for federal departments and agencies. During Marcia's 10-year tenure at PSPC, she provided strategic and legal advice for some of Canada's largest defense and major crown procurements. Turning to Andrew, for over 2 decades, Andrew has provided strategic and legal advice to corporate leaders, policymakers, and cabinet members. Andrew served from 2010 to 2015 as Chief of Staff to successive Ministers of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, working with his team to manage some of the most critical files facing the Government of Canada in the areas of national security, policing, borders and trade, and disaster response. These included foreign direct investment, cybersecurity, irregular migration, and anti-terrorism. Faye Voight is an associate based in Fasken's Ottawa office and works closely with Fasken's Procurement and International Trade and Customs groups. Faye has developed an expertise in the area of government procurement, corporate, commercial, communications, and national security law. So we'll turn it over to Marcia, just mentioning that we do have a Q&A session at the end, so if you have questions, you're able to submit them via the chat. Marcia, turning it over to you. Just waiting for Marcia to begin.
Hi, Nick, can you hear?
Yes, Marcia, you're ready to begin. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for that delay. This morning, we're going to be talking about defense contractors and things that are of particular interest to them. So for example, I'll be talking about the Industrial and Technological Benefits Program. Shannon will be talking about the Controlled Goods Program, and Faye will be talking about the World Trade Organization Agreement on Government and Public Procurement. We'll then circle back to look a bit about what's happening with regard to COVID and what to think about in that regard. I just want to check with Nick, are we getting an echo?
Not as bad, like still sounds pretty clear on my end.
Okay. So one of the things I wanted to reference before we start is a couple of things to keep in mind when you're dealing with a complex procurement. And this is often the case with defense procurement. So a complex defense procurement usually have an industry day or a preliminary request for information or solicitation request. And they may even provide the release of a draft RFP to industry for comment. The time between the close of a solicitation and the final evaluation can vary, extending perhaps up to a year in cases where there's a significant large assets that have to be tested or evaluated. Pre-qualification is a likely requirement and may even be conducted ahead of the release of the RFP. You'll always see a two-phase selection process in a major complex procurement in order to, as we mentioned in part one, prevent the loss of bidders for minor technicalities. Even if there's a negotiated RFP where the final selected bidder has the opportunity to negotiate terms of the final contract, the same acquisition process will be followed. If there are bidders meetings during the solicitation process, they would usually be held earlier in the process, perhaps while requirements are still being finalized, and they may be very circumscribed. So it may not be a meeting so much as it's a status update with the procurement team giving you an update on their progress. Complex procurements are going to have a more detailed and complicated internal approval process, and Treasury Board approval is required for any contracts issued by the SPC, who's the main buyer on defense contracts, that exceed certain prescribed limits. And as a result, most, if not all, major defense projects are going to require Treasury Board approval. This approval process is conducted in phases, beginning with the program approval in the early stages of a procurement, even before the development of an RFP. There may or may not be requirements to return to Treasury Board for interim approval as the project proceeds, but there will likely be a requirement to seek a final approval prior to entering into any major contracts. This will usually occur following the selection of a successful proponent and just before the final contract award is made. If we can have the next slide, please, Michael. And the next one, thanks. Right there. So it's a bit of background. The Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy, or ITBs, originally began as the Industrial and Regional Benefits Policy over 20 years ago. While defense contractors were subject to its requirements for selected defense procurements, they weren't evaluated on this aspect during a procurement process. In other words, a company could bid on a contract and the IRB policy didn't impact the bid outcome. So this all changed in 2014. As part of the Conservative government's defense procurement strategy, which is still in existence today, the IRB policy was changed to the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy. The bidders were evaluated on their economic commitments as part of their bids, and this is known as the value proposition component of the bid. The ITB policy is applied to all defense and Coast Guard contracts over $100 million that aren't otherwise subject to the trade agreements. Contracts between 20 and 100 million may also have the ITB policy applied on an optional basis. As I mentioned, the ITB policy is only applied in instances where trade agreements are not applicable due to the fact that this type of approach constitutes a local supplier preference, amongst other things, and are generally prohibited by the trade agreement. The program requires that contractors return an equivalent of 100% of the contract value back to the Canadian economy. The general value attributed to this part of the bid was 10% of the overall score. And at the beginning of the direct inclusion of the ITB policy and solicitations, the 10% was really easy to obtain because it just required that the bidder run through a check the box type of commitment process. However, of course, since then it's morphed and it's become a more detailed assessment, with bidders being required to submit actual socioeconomic plans that are evaluated and scored. So the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development is responsible for this aspect of the procurement. They develop the policy, they determine how it will be applied in conjunction with the end user client for each procurement, and they participate in the bid eval. So as I mentioned in part one, some departments have more than one name, and I said Innovation, Science, and Economic Development is one of those lucky departments. Their statutory name is still Industry Canada, but their working title is Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, or ISED. I mention this because if you are executing an ITB implementation agreement with ISED, you may actually see that the signatory is Industry Canada, but they're one in the same department. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you a list of what the ITB submission requires, including direct and indirect commitments, proof of an export strategy, and the ITB plan that addresses how the ITBs are going to be implemented, including the corporate plan. So the ITB plan is one of the areas where, as we talked about in part one, social policy considerations come into play, and it's very much in the forefront. This is really a social policy driven approach, including the requirements for regional development plan, small business plans, and gender and diversity plans. Next slide, please, Michael. Thank you. So as you can see on the slide, the program requires contracts to satisfy identified requirements, such as proof that the ITB commitment led to in-Canada development and proof of execution on the commitments with eligible recipients and within the required time frame. For each procurement, there's going to be specifically identified key industrial capabilities, or KICs, that the ITB policy intends to specifically promote. So there are 16 KICs, and they're divided into two categories. Category 1 covers emerging tech, and this is tech that can provide the opportunity for rapid growth and significant opportunity in Canada. These are established capabilities where Canada is competitive on the global scale, including advanced materials, AI, cyber resilience, remotely piloted systems, and autonomous technologies and space systems. So you'll note that some of these KICs are export controlled in the US, so it will raise interesting considerations for US firms. Category 2 covers what are known as defense sector leading competencies and critical industrial services. And they cover industries where domestic capacity is essential to national security. Some of them would be, of course, aerospace systems and components, armor, defense system integration, in-service support, munitions, shipbuilding, of course, and marine, shipborne mission and platform systems. So a lot of defense related. The KICs extend beyond the contract deliverables and are also focused on capabilities of post-secondary institutions that develop skills and research, the Canadian small and medium enterprises that form part of the value chain, and the intellectual property that's developed in Canada. So the KICs, as I mentioned, are designed to align with Canada's defense policy, but they're also designed to align with Canada's innovation and skills plan, which was announced by the Liberal government in the 2017 federal budget. The fundamental outcome of both policies is to increase innovation in Canada. Some of the criteria of the ITB plan will be mandatory requirements, such as, for example, a commitment for small and medium businesses as subcontractors or direct contractors, and gender and diversity programs, while other commitments may be point rated. So as you can see on the slide, the point rated criteria fall into the 5 categories: work in the Canadian defense sector, Canadian supplier development, R&D in Canada, exports from Canada, and skill development and training in Canada. The key term for all 5 categories is it's happening in Canada. The particular importance assigned to the KICs for any procurement will influence the weight of each of these 5 categories. So if we can just move on to the next slide, Michael, we'll show you an example. So as you can see on this scenario A demonstrates the weighting that could occur if emerging tech were determined to be the key industrial capability, while scenario B is an example of how leading competencies and critical industrial services could be weighted in each of the 5 areas, depending on their degree of importance. However, I will note that the question remains as to whether or not the ITBs are doing what they set out to do. The publicly available information on the ITBs and its economic impact is provided only at the higher level, So ISED has indicated that as a result of the ITB policy investment, significant investment has occurred in Canada, including job creation. But the ISED annual reports are extremely high level, and they don't appear to be at this point conducting in-depth assessment of the data, at least nothing that we're seeing publicly. There's no comparative data with respect to whether the ITB investments would have occurred in any event, and if so, to what extent. So for example, if in-service support had to be conducted in Canada anyway, that would still be considered to have met the requirements of the ITB program, but it might have been just a practical outcome of any procurement. So there's also no detailed data available as yet with respect to the long-term ITB impact in identified sectors and whether those sectors are healthy enough to continue or stagnate or maybe will shrink if the ITB monies are no longer flowing. Also, of course, to note, while the ITB is called a policy, there's no actual policy. Rather, the ITB is a program intended to leverage investment in Canada to support the defense sector and other emerging tech. So at this point, I will now pass, oh, sorry, no, I will raise one more issue. If we can just go to the next slide. And the next, yeah. One final comment with regard to innovation is the Department of National Defense also has its own innovation program called Innovation for Defense Excellence and Security, or the IDEAS program. So in this case, the Department of National Defense lets industry know what it's looking for. And the program is a more prescriptive program than one where innovators might be invited to an open innovation day, for example, where they present their own ideas. So it isn't, for those of you that have worked with the TechStars program in the US, it's not a parallel to TechStars. There's no innovator support program, for example. This is pure technology innovation. At this point, recipients also appear to often be well-established defense contractors or universities, so not as many small startup innovators as you would expect. The program is new, so it isn't clear yet whether the funding leads to sustainable development. So far, the program hasn't provided statistics on successful applicants. For example, small businesses have gained innovative advancement through the program, and whether there's been any follow-on development. So for example, once a company stops receiving IDEAS funding, does it continue to innovate? However, because the program's new, we may see this information coming out in the future. One other element to be aware of if you are looking at this program is that the intellectual property terms are not innovation focused. D&D does gather up a lot of IP related rights to the prototypes and to the innovation that's developed. So we have had a couple of clients look at those terms and decline to participate, specifically because although it's identified as an innovation program, there's broad licenses that are handed over to the government that don't really align very well with an innovative approach. All right, so now I will hand the mic over to Shannon, and she'll lead you through the control goods program.
Thanks, Marcia. Good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking to you about the controlled goods program in Canada. This is just going to be a high-level overview. I'm going to talk about the purpose of the program, its relationship to the United States. I'll describe the registration process just briefly and highlight a couple of exceptions to the registration requirements, and I'll note some potential penalties one may face for non-compliance. So to begin with the purpose of the program, Canada's Controlled Goods Program was created in 2001, and as you can see, it's intended to mitigate the risk of proliferation of tactical and strategic assets. It's intended to help strengthen Canada's defense trade controls and to support Canada's domestic and its security interests internationally. Now, the program looks to achieve these objectives by ensuring controlled goods are protected against unauthorized access while they're in Canada. It's a federal program and it's administered by Public Services and Procurement Canada, or PSPC. And again, the legal name for PSPC is Public Works and Government Services Canada. Next slide, please. So since the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, were established in the 1970s in the US, Canada has held an exemption to certain export and temporary import licensing requirements of ITAR. Now, the US briefly revoked Canada's license exemption in 1999, citing security concerns with how the exemption was being abused. So to address these concerns and to regain its license exemption, Canada created the Controlled Goods Program in 2001, and this was done to better control access to defense and dual-use articles while in Canada. And dual use meaning goods or technology that can be used both for civilian and military purposes. Now, the requirements of the program can be found under Canada's Defence Production Act and Controlled Goods Regulations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Controlled Goods Program was developed in response to US requirements and to, in some ways, serve as a counterpart to ITAR for Canadian businesses. The program also satisfies Canada's obligations under a number of international non-proliferation treaties as well. So the Controlled Goods Program may be relevant to a number of US companies. For example, where a US company has a Canadian office or a Canadian subsidiary that will require access to controlled goods or technology while they're in Canada. Now, this is because while operating in Canada, an individual or a company must be required to register with the program, or they must be exempted or excluded from registration. And this must be done prior to when they, or in the case of a company with their personnel, it has to be done prior to when they access controlled goods or technology. Additionally, registration is required for some Canadian government contracts. So, of course, it's important that a US company that intends to bid on one of these contracts understand that its registration obligations exist and understand what their particular circumstances will require. Next slide, please. So to fulfill its objectives, the program prevents access, again, to controlled goods by unauthorized persons. So these are those who are not registered under the program or not otherwise excluded or exempt from the requirements to register. Now, for simplicity's sake, I've been talking about access to controlled goods, but the legislation actually specifies that anyone who examines, possesses, or transfers controlled goods or technology in Canada must register with the program unless, again, they fall under the exception or exemption from registration. I do want to emphasize as well that the program deals with access to controlled goods in Canada. So goods, how goods get in and out of Canada is still regulated by Canada's export control regime. Next slide, please. So on your screen are a couple of the exemptions from registration that are particularly relevant to US companies. So first we have the ITAR exemption. If a US company is properly registered under ITAR, it is exempt from the requirement to register under the Controlled Goods Program. We also have the visitor exemption, where if a Canadian subsidiary of a US company is registered under the program, and then someone from the US parent company's office will come and access controlled goods while visiting the subsidiary's office, that individual must be registered as a visitor of the Canadian subsidiary, who is the program registrant. You notice that both of these exemptions do require steps to be taken prior to this access in order to be in compliance with the Controlled Goods Program. Next slide, please. Now, I won't go into too much detail about this slide, as they'll be provided after, but along with the two exemptions I just mentioned that are particularly relevant to US companies, this slide lists the exceptions to and exemptions from registration in the program. And again, I'll draw your attention to the fact that all of these require some action to be taken prior to access in order to be in compliance with the program. Next slide, please. So this will be a very brief overview of how to register with the Controlled Goods Program. Basically, the first step is preparing for the application for registration. There's a lot that goes into this, but it's just very important to ensure that the application is accurate and it's complete once it's submitted, because mistakes or incomplete information can lead to delays in the process and the assessment process from the Controlled Goods Program, and they have openly said that this will lead to substantial delays. The second step, the Controlled Goods Directorate will assess the application, and this includes security assessments of certain individuals that are required to be named in the application. So this takes some time through that as well. And of course, as we are all dealing with a pandemic right now, PSPC has indicated that these assessments will likely take longer than they normally have as they're prioritizing pandemic response. Finally, once registered in the program, a program registrant has ongoing compliance obligations, and there are a number of them, but for example, they must develop and implement a security plan for every worksite where controlled goods are kept, and then they must maintain that security plan going forward. They also must conduct security assessments of every individual within their organization who will access controlled goods. Next slide, please. So unlike many federal procurement programs in Canada, such as the Contract Security Program that Faye talked about on Tuesday, or the ITB policy Marcia was just speaking about, the Controlled Goods Program is statutory based as opposed to policy driven. So as you can see from this slide, non-compliance with registration requirements goes beyond just contractual penalties and can result in a summary or indictable offense. And it can bring with it financial penalties of up to $2 million, and imprisonment is also a possibility. Now, that all said, I do want to point out that these are more severe penalties than the policy-based programs entail, but the penalties under the US ITAR regime are more substantial financial penalties than what you find under the Controlled Goods Program. So with that, I think I'll pass things over to Faye to talk about the trade agreement.
Thank you, Shannon. So, as most of you know, the USMCA came into force this past July. And with that, it means that the NAFTA has been replaced. So as a result, there's a few changes to the government procurement rulebook that I'm going to be detailing in my presentation today. So similar to other trade agreements, the USMCA does contain a chapter on government procurement. However, the key difference with the USMCA is that the government procurement chapter does not actually apply to Canada. This, however, does not mean that there are no longer any rules that apply to government procurement between Canada and the United States. What it does mean is that the rules of the World Trade Organization Agreement on Government Procurement, which I will refer to as WTO in this presentation, will fill this gap. Next slide, please. So in order to simply address the changes that result from the introduction of the USMCA and replacement of the NAFTA, we've broken them down into three key areas: who is covered, what is covered, and when are procurements covered. And before I dive into these changes, I want to note that anytime I'm referring to something as being covered under the WTO that was not covered under the NAFTA is not net new coverage. The WTO has been in place, both Canada and the US signed on in 2010. So this coverage under the WTO that I'll be referring to has been in place since then. Next slide, please. In terms of who is covered, there is one additional entity at the federal level that is covered under the WTO that was not covered under the NAFTA, and that entity is the Department of Transport. However, you'll see on this slide here that only procurements of certain goods are covered, notably those related to certain types of equipment. Next slide, please. The bigger difference in terms of covered entities under the NAFTA versus the WTO is at the sub-federal level. The NAFTA did not actually provide for coverage of sub-federal entities, being the provinces and the states. However, the WTO does. In terms of who is covered, each province will set out the specific entities that are covered, which usually include the ministries, departments, and agencies of that province. However, those provinces and states can also specify excluded covered entities and excluded procurements, which are often those relating to highway projects or procurements relating to economic development. Next slide, please. Now, looking at what is covered, there is again a difference between the covered goods under the NAFTA versus the covered goods and services under the USMCA. The NAFTA is a by exception trade agreement. What this means is that all goods and services are by default covered unless the NAFTA specifically excluded them. On the other hand, the WTO is the inverse. It is a by inclusion agreement. This means that only those goods and services that are explicitly stated in the agreement are covered. Next slide. looking at when procurements are covered. Here we're talking about the monetary thresholds after which trade agreement protections kick in. The thresholds applicable to goods and services under the WTO are higher than they were under the NAFTA. This means that some of the protections under the trade agreement do not kick in for some of the lower value procurements that may have been covered under the NAFTA. On the other hand, the thresholds for construction services are lower under the WTO than they were under the NAFTA. This means that some lower value procurements that may have been covered, that are covered by the WTO may not have been covered by the NAFTA previously. However, whenever I want to remind you that whenever the WTO seems to provide greater coverage, I just want to remind you that this coverage has been in place as between Canada and the US since 2010. Next slide, please. I've included this slide and the following slide as a reference slide for you to refer to in the future in case you find yourself bidding on a Canadian government procurement or considering it, and you want to confirm what the applicable threshold is. So if you could skip ahead 2 slides. Perfect. Now, with that overview, I'm now going to briefly discuss the avenues through which you can challenge a procurement conducted by the Canadian government. Marcia touched on this briefly on Tuesday, but I'm going to go into it in a bit more detail. So in the case that the procurement you're challenging is covered by a trade agreement, you have broader protections and therefore broader avenues through which you can challenge it. So specifically, there are 3 avenues through which you can challenge it. First would be by filing a complaint with an independent administrative body. At the federal level, we have the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. And this is an established body that has a fairly efficient process through which you can challenge procurements conducted by the federal government. At the sub-federal level, there are fewer options. There's only 5 Canadian provinces that have formal dispute processes. However, I do note that the Western provinces offer a bid protest mechanism, and this process is quite formal and cost-effective. Now, the second option suppliers have at which they can challenge a procurement conducted by a Canadian government is to challenge it in the courts through a judicial review of the procuring entity's decision. And usually that decision you're challenging is going to be the decision to award the contract to another bidder. Lastly, suppliers can file a claim within the courts for breach of trade agreement obligation. However, we don't see this happening very often just due to the fact that there is such an efficient process that suppliers have access to through the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. And I will note additionally that if a supplier were to file a complaint with the CITT and receive an unfavorable decision, the supplier does have the option to challenge that decision in the Canadian courts through a judicial review of the CITT's decision, as opposed to the procuring entity's decision, which I referenced earlier. Next slide, please. With respect to those avenues of challenge that I've mentioned, I want to note that outside of the CITT avenue, there is relatively limited case law on these in this area. There just haven't been as many cases brought outside of the CITT, so there's limited case law here. Additionally, I want to make sure that you're all aware that filing cases at the CITT specifically and at the administrative bodies carry short limitation periods, generally 10 days. So what this means is it's really important to stay on top of any procurement that you're considering bidding on or are have been awarded, and stay on top of any of those issues, raising them with the procuring entities and being ready to file a challenge if required. And finally, I want to note that those avenues I mentioned in the previous slide are not exclusive. So what this means is a supplier that wants to challenge a procurement conducted by a Canadian government can challenge it at both an administrative tribunal, such as the CITT, and in the Canadian courts at the same time. And this is actually something we frequently advise our clients to do for strategic reasons. Next slide, please. So as I've gone through this presentation, I've detailed cases where the procurement coverage by trade agreement has decreased as a result of the coming into force of the USMCA and replacement of the NAFTA. So what this means is that some procurements now no longer can make a complaint that their trade agreement rights have been violated. And so I'm going to detail the avenues that a supplier that has or is bidding on or has a non-trade agreement covered procurement has to challenge it. So the main difference when a procurement is not covered by a trade agreement is that you lose the option to file a complaint at an administrative body such as the CITT. However, you can still challenge it in the courts through a judicial review of the procuring entity's decision. And finally, you can also make a general claim for damages in the courts based on general tendering common law. And finally, I want to note, because I realize many of you may be familiar with the commonly used US processes, such as the Government Accountability Office. I just want to clarify that Canada does not have an equivalent to these. So you're limited to the avenues that I've just detailed. So with that, I hope that gives you some food for thought in the event that you find yourself bidding on a contract with the Canadian government. And with that, I will hand it back to Marcia.
Thank you, Faye. So as I mentioned in part one, I added a fourth category to my trends discussion. That's the impact of COVID on procurement. So had we done this webinar in August, I would have been speaking about the opening up of the. We are now moving into the second wave, where things have once again, where things have once again become uncertain about when we're going to go back to the normal and what this new normal is going to look like. So far, we've seen some indications at the federal level that some procurement processes are being returned to normal status. And federally, the Treasury Board has recently released its approach to a phased return to operations, but this is all contingent on rates of infection. And one point I'll note is that currently, as of this week, Ottawa is one of the Canadian cities that has the unfortunate title of being an infection hotspot. Why this is relevant is because the majority of procurement work happens here and directly across the border in Gatineau, our sister city. So the impact of shutdowns necessarily impacts the government operations. So as we talked about in part one, and as Faye's just touched on, Canada is a very trade agreement friendly country with at least 15 international and 1 national trade agreement. And the prime objective of all of these is to reduce trade barriers across national and international borders. However, as we all noticed, as countries quickly discovered during the pandemic, and despite all of the open trade agreements, those who had the production facilities for personal protective equipment or in-country suppliers of raw materials for production locked them down and nationalized them. Those who didn't have the necessary facilities were left scrambling and fighting amongst themselves for supplies and inventories. Countries, including Canada, that were subject to free trade agreements exercised their trade agreement exceptions from open competitive procurement in response to their national or regional safety and security considerations, and they quickly moved to sole sourcing or limited tendering scenarios in the face of what is characterized as an unforeseen emergency. We often think of national security issues only within the context of national defense or perhaps more recently cybersecurity, but we've all been reminded that the national security element is far, far broader than this. In fact, Canada and the provinces have agreed on 10 identified critical infrastructures, none of which specifically refer to national defense or defense, but rather they identify infrastructure that relates to and supports national defense through finance, health, food, water, manufacturing. So COVID has fundamentally changed the way we look at security, and we expect that this redefinition is going to stay in place and be a primary influencer of how government will contract in the present and near future. Next slide, please, Michael. Thank you. So when will business return to normal? The short answer is no one knows. Some of the approaches initially considered to be short-term solutions are now becoming more permanent processes as new ways of doing business are starting to arise. I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone on the call today that I expect government programs and operations are going to continue to be impeded. And as we've seen, as I mentioned, reopenings are actually temporary. When infection rates spike, closures follow. So as a result, I expect that government resources are going to continue to be strained by the uncertainty of the longevity of any reopening and the factors such as we've got here on the slide. So governments all across the world are having to manage multiple competing tasks. So they have to manage programs they implemented during pandemic, for example, salary and wage support. They have to bring all the regular programs and services back online. And they have to clean up the backlogs of work they weren't able to conduct. Then there's the difficulty of resource management. Trying to return public servants back to work, then having to send them home, then bringing them back is a constant issue. And we've heard of one federal agency that's already let its people know that they are work at home permanently now. Finally, there's the technology challenges. The federal government in Canada has around 300,000 employees that range from coast to coast to coast. And they're still having employees who have to share bandwidth during the day because of bandwidth constraints. One of the programs, for example, that is still working in a constrained operative methodology is the Controlled Goods Program that Faye talked about today, and the Contract Security Program that she spoke about on Tuesday. The next slide, please. So I expect there's certain inherent pressures that are going to continue to influence the government contracting process. Principally the requirement to assure value for money in procurement, combined with the cost of the government response to the pandemic, is necessarily going to lead to spending cuts and reevaluation of programs, particularly those that aren't deemed essential. So although you might expect that as the government develops processes and an ability to respond to the pandemic over time, they won't apply the trade agreement exceptions from open procurement, I think as we enter the second wave, it's likely that any return to the way it was isn't going to happen anytime soon. And we're going to continue to see the exceptions from trade agreements being applied. I think ultimately the theme that we saw at the outset of the pandemic and that is still echoing today, that we never want to end up like this again, is going to be a continual theme and a driver of any procurement decisions. Next slide, please. So it's reasonable to expect that this means there's going to be a greater focus on critical infrastructure procurements and supply chain integrity assessments that we talked about on Tuesday, so that the government can ensure a secure domestic source of supply, or at least an increased ability to stockpile. Procurements that would normally be subject to trade agreements, as I mentioned, may start to be excluded from the application, either on the federal level using the national security exception, or on the provincial and sub-provincial levels, the public safety and security exceptions. As I mentioned, during the pandemic, many governments around the world exercised their rights under the trade agreements to remove procurement from open competitive tendering on the basis of the national security exception. Or they invoked the rules for limited tendering, which allowed them to go out only to, for example, a list of selected suppliers, or to shorten timeframes for bidders to respond. Now, as the government begins to develop processes to address the pandemic, even if the acquisition of goods and services remains urgent, the requirement is arguably no longer unforeseeable, particularly in light of the forecasted second wave of infections, as in we've seen this once, we should be able to deal with it on the second time around. But even if the trade agreement processes are reestablished, I would expect that, as I mentioned, the supply chain integrity assessments are going to become more common in procurements. And suppliers of essential goods and services, particularly those in the critical infrastructure realm, should be prepared for assessment of their supply chains or a requirement that their supply chain be located either partially or fully within Canada. Next slide, please. So suppliers have had the opportunity to contract with governments as part of the procurements related to COVID should still be mindful that at some point the government is and will be brought to account for its spending and will need to validate its actions. And we've seen that occurring on the federal level in the past few weeks, with the opposition party in Canada raising concerns with regard to spending during the pandemic. So although we saw the unprecedented cooperation between all levels of government at the start of the pandemic, I think we're starting to see the shift, at least in political realm, back to the new normal, or the normal of opposition parties raising concerns. One thing that's certain is that the spending accountability is going to be subject to audit, either by the contracting department that issued the contract or in the broader government-wide context. So for example, the Auditor General for Canada, in her appearance before the House of Commons Finance Committee recently, reported and identified that she's now working with the Department of Finance to determine what additional funding will be required to exercise her audit function. And although she's identified that she won't be auditing every program the government has put in place to deal with COVID, because that will be impossible, she does have a list of priorities that she's identified, one of which is the government's personal protective equipment acquisitions for healthcare workers. She'll also be looking at Canada's food supply and food security, and we'll be taking a more detailed look at some of the emergency response benefits that the government offered. Of course, in her presentation, she did identify that there are other areas not related to COVID that are going to be audited, with military spending being top priority. Not a surprise, because it always is. And as those of you in the US have already noted, your Department of Justice is beginning their audit and prosecutions and investigations of spending with regard to COVID-related contracts, as is the government of the UK. So I think ultimately, in addition to the possibility that the governments themselves may begin to exclude procurements from trade agreement coverage, we may even see a shift in the approach to trade agreement negotiation in the future, as countries, particularly those hardest hit by the pandemic, start to reassess how to avoid such a situation in the future. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Andrew House.
Thank you, Marcia, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. We had intended to be with you in person, a trip I was very much looking forward to, and I hope we will, at some point in future, have a chance to do that. This portion of the presentation will be a marked departure from that which you've enjoyed to this point. Our firm relies on people like Marcia and Faye and Shannon for technical excellence in the law. I like to think I'm a good lawyer and a good practitioner, but I practice in an area that is much more, I suppose, art than science. And for some of you, the practice of government relations is old hat. And much of what I will say to you will either sound perhaps trite or covering old ground. But for those of you who look upon Canada with a certain amount of intrigue and mystery, I hope this will be somewhat enjoyable to you and informative. You'll see that this slide is entitled Speaking to Canadians. This is a riff on one of my favorite Canadian comedians, a fellow by the name of Rick Mercer, who a number of years ago did several episodes where he would travel into the United States and speak to American citizens about Canada, convincing them humorously of such untruths as Canada had recently joined North America, and causing the American viewers or participants to warmly congratulate Canada. And in my favorite episode, asking Americans to condemn Canada's practice of placing senior citizens on ice floes in the north of Canada, and the looks of admonition and horror made for some incredible TV. Now, lest you think that I'm just making fun, the purpose in sharing this with you is to illustrate and underscore the reality that not everything translates well back and forth across the 49th parallel. As much as we like to think that Canadians and Americans are very much on the same wavelength, and I think in large part we are, there are some distinct differences, and those differences, as you enter the lion's den of procurement in Canada, really can make a difference. And I will talk about some of the ways to navigate the political dimension of procurement in the next few minutes. So Canada is obviously a democracy, like the United States, but it is also, and this will come as a surprise to some and not at all to others, a constitutional monarchy. And there is such a important cultural tradition that stems from that. We have a queen. She is Canada's head of state, and she actually has a representative in Canada that signs our laws. Things do not become law unless that signature is applied. Again, probably not a shock to most of you, but what it means is that we follow the Westminster tradition. And that has very, very serious implications for how government works in Canada. In the United States, when a cabinet is formed, it is built from the very best and wisest people, hopefully, who can be found in the United States. These are people that in the past, when I was in the government of Canada, and we would travel to Washington, I was always taken aback by the quality of people, not only their interaction with us, but their backgrounds. People came from military, athletic, cultural, musical backgrounds, and then had spent time either in the practice of law or academia, and then had chosen to serve in the U.S. cabinet as secretaries of various departments. In Canada, and I mean no disrespect to anyone who has served in the Canadian cabinet, but there is a limitation. As the saying goes, the cabinet is built with the wood available. And what that means is that our cabinet is by convention almost exclusively composed of members of parliament, which means we are limited in the selection to the 338 men and women who sit in our federal legislature, and then further limited to those who sit on the government side. Sometimes senators form part of the Canadian cabinet. We have a bicameral federal legislature like the United States, but one half of ours is unelected. Our Senate is appointed, and that introduces into the Canadian system all kinds of volatility as you have a group of people who have law-making and law-passing power who are not accountable electorally to anyone. They are appointed not for life, but until the age of 75. And the volatility that can sometimes introduce into the review of government action in the upper chamber really is quite striking, and has become more so in recent years as the Senate has become more activist. Turning for a moment to a reality that will be most important for those of you in the security and defense corridor, Canada is almost, I would argue, en masse, a quasi-pacifist nation. We are interested in peacekeeping, not peacemaking. We have for years subscribed to something called a soft power doctrine. This comes primarily from the Liberal Party of Canada. It had a very, I would argue, proud tradition through the 1990s, where our foreign minister of the day felt that moral suasion and not military might was the way to have influence in the world. I experienced the downstream effect of a soft power doctrine when I spent time on the ground in Kosovo just after the war in that part of the world, where there was an absolutely immense U.S. military presence. There was a base called Film City that sort of sat on a perch above the capital of Kosovo, and at any time, if you had the right credentials, you could leave Southern Europe and actually feel like you were in a Midwest American town. You could get a burger at Burger King or go to a movie at a theater and have all the comforts of being back in North America and not in a low intensity conflict zone. There were 2 Canadians present in the entire mission. I think there were more than 14,000 troops of other nationalities, primarily American. And this was a downstream effect of the government of Canada's view of having soft power influence. What it meant in actual fact is we had very little influence at all. Canada is also very careful about unilateral action. Unlike the United States, we walk the careful path of multilateralism. It means that in all that we do, we want to not be first to do something. We often want to be third or fourth. Very much happy to be part of UN action, less so NATO action, but reluctantly willing to go ahead, and almost never unilateral. The impact for people who are involved in procurement, and this will come as no surprise to many of you who are on the line right now, is that when you sell in Canada, messaging is almost important as the goods and services that are being sold. Canada and Canadians are often not willing or able to process that military and security technology will be used in a military or offensive sense. It has to be tied in some way, in a messaging sense, to what we would call sovereignty protection. And this is perhaps where such great controversy has broken out about something like the F-35. There has been almost endless talk about the fact that jet is a single engine aircraft, and how could it possibly be safe to fly in the northern regions of Canada? And the reason people focus on that issue is that they are very much obsessed not with interoperability in a NATO mission, but rather survivability in a single flight over the North Pole. And this is part and parcel of what it means to do military and security procurement in Canada. And I think some of these lessons, if they're not baked into your approach to government relations in a procurement mode, into the very messaging that is used, the words that are used in speaking with Canadian politicians, this is where trouble can really begin. Economic nationalism is also a big feature of how things work in the government of Canada, and it is also baked into the national psyche. One of the first transactions blocked in Canada, this was it's a mergers and acquisition of a proud Canadian company by an American, essentially a space company. It involved purchasing the company that built the Canadarm, which forms such an important and central part of the shuttle missions. And the government of Canada actually reached out, ostensibly on national security grounds, to block the sale of that Canadian company to a US firm, not because there were any actual national security secrets between Canada and the US. There are very few, I think, but because it didn't look right to have an American firm buy that company that designed and operated the Canadarm. So that gives you some sense of where Canadians are coming from on issues related to the United States, in spite of the fact that there is such an enduring and close, warm relationship between our two countries. Canadians are often said to define themselves negatively. What does it mean to be Canadian? Well, it means to not be American. And that isn't meant in an insulting way. In fact, there is an enduring respect for America. But as you see in the slide, there is, at this time in particular, almost a fear of or a fear for. And this weaves itself into the story that Canadians tell themselves about their relationship with the United States. With those preliminaries out of the way, and I hope that didn't bore anyone, this, I think, is a valuable thing to have in the back of your mind as you work through the technicalities of procurement in Canada. We'll go to the next slide, please. It can be argued that if you're going to engage in procurement, it is entirely appropriate, indeed necessary, to play strictly by the rules. Communicate only with those who will ultimately manage the procurement and speak to no one else. The problem with that approach is that major procurement in Canada is a cabinet level decision, at least a decision in principle. It then returns through the bureaucracy and is ultimately operationalized by another committee of cabinet, the Treasury Board. But it begins at the cabinet level, rather begins with officials who propel a decision upward, but it's the Cabinet of Canada, comprised of members of Parliament, who themselves are seeking re-election, even as they seek to maintain their position in Cabinet, who must decide that a procurement will proceed. Any federal contract is not only deeply technical, but deeply political, no matter what process is followed. And here, I think there's an interesting observation, and there will be people who will disagree with this. I hope it only promotes thought and discussion, maybe later in your day, as you think about this presentation. Canada's procurement system seems to swing back and forth. And you can think of something like the building of naval vessels, where the government of the day, and this was a conservative government, made every effort to disengage the political class from the procurement entirely. And it was worn as a badge of honor when the procurement was announced that the minister in question had no idea who the winner was, was never presented with the names, had no involvement in the process. And very proudly stood at the mic and announced this. Well, that is a far cry from what you see today in the midst of COVID, where you see repeated sole sourcing. And the narrative has now shifted from ministers must be completely hands-off to ministers must see to that first duty, which is to see to the safety and security of Canadians in the midst of a global pandemic. And what you see there is a tension between removing politics from procurement completely so as to ensure that there's not even a hint of scandal or corruption. And that's at one end of the pendulum swing, right over to the other end of that arc, where politicians cannot afford to be hands-off. And at each end of the pendulum, some form of controversy will break out. Usually there's some form of investigation or ethics scandal which follows, and then the pendulum is swung back. Another pendulum is the narrative of we've got to support the troops and give them the equipment they need. And that means that we need to really be on a spending spree. We need to dial back public spending on the arts and on social safety net, and we need to make sure our soldiers, our men and women in uniform, have the tools to fight that they need. And this was at its height as Canada was part of a war in Afghanistan in the post 9/11 environment and for many years afterwards. And you saw a lot of spending, a lot of defense procurement in that era. And then as the economic crisis of 2008 fully took hold, the narrative swung back, the pendulum swung again towards we have to fight the deficit. We need to make sure that we don't simply take it as an article of faith or at face value that when the Department of National Defense says it needs trucks, that we simply buy them trucks. And so what you have there are two pendulums, if I can put it that way, swinging on opposite axes, and you all are caught in the middle. And knowing where to stand and where the pendulum is and which way it's moving is critical in knowing how to position yourself in the midst of a government relations effort in support of a procurement. One of the things that good defense contractors do in Ottawa is they shape the needs, and they do so early. In other words, rather than waiting for the government to announce its procurement needs in defense and security or in other areas of procurement, I think people who have had the most success in Ottawa have had close and enduring ties, not only with men and women in uniform and the materiel section of the Department of National Defense, public safety, the various security agencies, our national police force, but also close ties to those wings of the political class who are attuned to the needs of each of these agencies and organizations, and even to the people who are building the political platforms for the elections to come. And this thinking, it happens, as you all know, it needs to happen a number of years in advance. Procurement does not happen overnight or on a dime unless we are in the middle of a procurement. And those who are able not only to react to what the government says it wants and needs, but ensure that those wants and needs are defined by what the marketplace can offer at a given time with production schedules in mind. These are the people who succeed in Ottawa. Now, you see the word triangulation as government relations. I use this word because when I was in government, I served as a chief of staff to the Minister of Public Safety. We were so busy, so inundated with problems, from everything from trying to help the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to tell their story of policing, which was often quite successful but never told properly, to managing the correctional system, trying to manage our border in such a way that it would remain open to legitimate trade and travel, and closed in such a way as to inspire US confidence that we were on top of the anti-terror file, that we barely had time to hear from stakeholders. It was a rarity when I could actually take a meeting with a lobbyist who was there to explain to me what was available in the next generation of policing technology, security and intel, data management, so on and so forth. And what I noticed in myself and in my own reaction was I didn't take meetings until I had heard about someone, heard about a problem and a solution from at least 3 sources. I needed to read about it in the press. I might need to hear about it from the legal department of a government agency. In other words, there's a legal vulnerability here. And then I also needed to hear it from an advocate of the company. And what was best was the company itself, often with some form of GR support. It wasn't until I got input from those 3 directions that I actually said to myself and to my minister, we actually need to meet with these people. We need to take this seriously. Something is afoot here. Any one of those inputs simply didn't raise the issue with enough urgency that I was willing to prioritize it. Maybe that made me a bad chief of staff. I actually think it probably was a common experience across government. I share it with you because I think this is how good GR is done. You have to come at a decision maker from a variety of angles, and you have to have your perspective verified by other parties, either in the media or in the legal world, or within the department itself, where good relationships can be built at the lower levels and good ideas pushed up through the chain of command. We'll go to the next slide, please. So I've just talked about the importance of lobbying, and lobbying from multiple directions, and not just lobbying, but having a fairly robust engagement campaign that includes not only conventional government relations or lobbying, but also awareness raising within departments, along with earned media through conventional and social media channels. But all of this, if it is outside the strict confines of the procurement process, is lobbying. If you are, in fact, seeking a policy change, and a policy change is defined in Canada's lobbying rules in a very broad fashion. And so you'll see in the first bullet, communication by an employee. This is an employee, for instance, of a defense contractor or a service provider with a public office holder. Who is a public office holder? Anyone paid by Her Majesty, because we are a constitutional monarchy, and someone signs checks on behalf of the Queen, literally, to pay those who work for our government. And so if you, as a salesperson, are speaking to a public office holder, you are communicating likely for the purpose of either sales or a policy change. I'd like to be clear, if you are selling to the government of Canada, that is not lobbying. If you are advocating for a policy change, that may well be lobbying, and knowing these rules is incredibly important. And here are the exceptions. And let me be clear, the exception in question is, when does a sales discussion become something that is more than sales? When it relates to communication with the government in relation to developing a new policy or program, amending an existing policy or program, or amending a law if a law needs to be amended in order to effect a sale. And you'll see that some federal procurements, usually because of their risk and their size financially, require approval from cabinet, which we've already talked about. If you are, even as an in-house lobbyist, advocating for one of these policy changes, that is lobbying and should be looked at through the lobbying lens to make sure that you're on the right side of the law. because the last thing you want in the midst of making very good policy suggestions to the government of Canada and doing what I've suggested, which is shaping what the government believes it needs to be, you want to make sure that you don't get tripped up by some allegation of illegal lobbying. That is counterintuitive and counterproductive to success in this arena. We'll go to the next slide, please. So let's revisit an issue that Marcia spoke about a few minutes ago, procurement in the COVID-19 environment. Incredible opportunities, but also a series of pitfalls that need to be understood to effectively sell to the government of Canada. The times have changed in regard to how alliances in the international community are viewed. There was a time when a corporate champion from a fellow NATO country, or especially a fellow Five Eyes country, would be looked upon by the government of Canada as entirely trustworthy. There was free admission that these companies were profit-seeking, but because they were from not only a friendly country, but countries so deeply trusted for the last 70 years that you could share at a state-to-state level your deepest concerns, your most fearful intelligence secrets, and your aspirations in that arena. That, in the midst of COVID-19, has begun to tragically shift. And the reason is scarcity. And economists will talk about this. Security officials now talk about scarcity. It meant that masks that were destined for Canada and desperately needed in the early fight against COVID-19 were, for a time, held up at the behest of the President of the United States. And they didn't immediately transit into Canada where they were needed. And some of you are familiar with this story. Some of you may even have been impacted by it. The situation was resolved, but it left scarring on Canada's political class. And you heard people like the Premier of Ontario say things like, we will never again be caught in this position. We will bring our production home because it is no longer safe to trust firms that we've always done business with, including in the United States. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that was his meaning. It was profound. And Doug Ford would be someone who would be friendly towards Donald Trump, who would not be an adversary. And still, this was his view of the world. It means that the government of Canada will look with a certain level of increased skepticism on commitments made by US firms that would never have been looked upon with anything other than good faith in the past. And it may now require that more lengths and more efforts are applied to reassure the government of Canada that what is promised will be delivered. Marcia mentioned Canadian critical infrastructure. These are defined tables, as they are known within the government of Canada, everything from financial services to communications technology to anything touching transportation, particularly public mass transit, and then things that are quite ill-defined, like the word safety. What does safety mean in that list? It is taken to mean usually anything that touches on either defense or security. Government itself is listed as Canadian critical infrastructure. And so when you are selling to the government, generally, you're already engaged in a sale that impacts Canadian critical infrastructure, namely the government of Canada. But you may also find that you intersect with things like transportation or safety or information and communications technology. Where you have a multiple intersect in that critical infrastructure world, expect the scrutiny to be even higher. And this is probably not a surprise to many of you, but it really is a profound new reality, or a reality that has become more profound in recent months. Supply chain integrity has, for most of us, meant that there are no opportunities within the supply chain for transshipment mischief, where goods are outside the controlled hands of those who can be trusted. It now means, and I'm referring back here to the anecdote about masks, it means the reliability of that supply chain. There's not a concern about interference with the goods or even necessarily temporary diversion, but simply a refusal to supply that which was purchased. And again, the need to reassure Canadian officials that what has been promised will be delivered, and to take steps to actively do that has become even more critical since March. And finally, Marcia also mentioned national security. For many years, national security in Canada was understood. By the way, it's not a defined term in Canadian law. National security is what the government of Canada needs it to mean at any given time. For many years, it meant the fight against terrorists and the countering of espionage in this country. It now profoundly also includes the protection of critical infrastructure. And again, we've talked a little bit about how that's defined in Canada. This concept has fully and finally made its way into the political mind, and things that would never before have been considered items touching upon national security, like masks, like life-saving pharmaceuticals, like ventilator components, are now very much considered by politicians to be issues of national security and treated as such. I think that brings me to the end. We'll flip ahead to one more slide to make sure I haven't missed anything. And there we are. I'll hand it back to Marcia and to Neil. And thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the question and answer component of the presentation. So a few questions that have come in. The first one is for Shannon. You mentioned that a controlled goods program registrant needs to create and maintain a security plan. Can you please explain what the security plan entails?
Thanks, Neil. Yes, so this is one of the registrant's compliance obligations once they're registered in the program. So a registrant in the program, they have to develop a security plan for every work site that they have where controlled goods are kept. And this is specified under the controlled goods regulations. A security plan, it has to provide specific information that is prescribed in the regulations that will include procedures to control the access to controlled goods and for reporting and investigating breaches of those procedures. It'll have to identify individuals of the registrant that are responsible for the security of the controlled goods, so implementing that plan. And there are also requirements for the contents of security briefings and training programs that are given to the employees, visitors, or officers or directors, anyone who's going to be dealing with controlled goods of that registrant. So then also once that plan is implemented, the program registrant will need to ensure that it's monitored and reassessed as times change. And then it's also important to note that the controlled goods program will subject a registrant to a compliance obligation inspection. And so at this point, a controlled goods program can come in and inspect the security plan as it's described, as it's been presented, and see if it's implemented in the way it's been described. And if there are any deficiencies, those will have to be dealt with at that point.
Thank you. Another question for you. If a company is registered in the controlled goods program, works with subcontractors, do the subcontractors themselves also need to be registered in the program?
Oh, so that's a good question because the answer is it depends. So it depends on what the subcontractor is doing for that controlled goods program registrant. So for example, a janitor is likely not the type of subcontractor that's going to need to be registered in the program because they're not likely to examine, possess, or transfer controlled goods. So that's the key. For a subcontractor, they have to register if they're going to examine, possess, or transfer controlled goods in relation to that contract. So if a subcontractor, in a less clear example, if a subcontractor is only manufacturing a component of a controlled good, but it's not going to be examining, possessing, or transferring that controlled good, they won't need to register in the program. But if the subcontractor is going to install the component in the controlled good, that would likely at a minimum require examining the controlled good. And therefore, that's going to require registration. So it's really context specific depending on what the subcontractor is doing in relation to controlled goods.
Okay. Thank you. Next question, actually two questions for Faye. The first one, you mentioned that we should review the agreement to determine if the products we sell to the Canadian government are still covered. What exactly in the agreement, where exactly in the agreement can we find this?
Right, so that is a good question. So the agreement you'll be looking at is the WTO agreement on government procurement. So I guess if you were to Google that agreement, you'll be able to go directly to the WTO Agreement on Government Procurement website. And from there, you can navigate to the coverage schedules, I believe is the tab that you'll be able to find this under. And from there, it will have coverage schedules for all the countries that are party to this agreement. You'll have to scroll to find Canada. And from there, you'll find coverage annexes or the schedules that set out coverage for each entities, goods, services, and construction services. So depending on what your product is or what it is you're looking to double check, you'll click on the appropriate schedule.
Okay, thank you. And the second question was that you had mentioned a handful of avenues a supplier can pursue to challenge a procurement. Which of these is most commonly used, and is there one avenue better than the other?
Right. So I would say the CITT is most commonly used, and I think I mentioned that earlier in the presentation, just that it's an established process, and because of the short timelines, it's very efficient. However, I'm not sure I would say one avenue is better than the other. What it will depend on is the facts of the specific procurement and just where you think you have the better argument. However, I also mentioned that we often advise our clients to file complaints at both the CITT and in the court, just to maximize your options. And it's something you have a right to do in this case. So there you go.
Okay, thanks, Faye. A couple of questions for Andrew. I think the first one is kind of a little bit more subjective, asking for your view on something. Is a black box experience unavoidable and understandable in national security context, or should the government be required to be more transparent? Do you think there's a sensible way to get insight and look into the black box, or get more information as to what's going on the government side of the process?
So this expression black box it's sort of entered common usage amongst those in Canada who just have frustration with what the government actually means by national security. There are those of us who, when we were in government, found it very, very convenient that the words were not defined and that the processes were very opaque and very difficult to review, either in the public forum or in a court. Having left government and now serving private clients, this is a very frustrating thing for people because you find yourself run up against rocks that were that you weren't warned about, and that are incredibly difficult to see. And you see this most frequently, I think, in the review of foreign investment, but it also certainly comes up in procurement. It is one of the issues on which Marcia, I think, most frequently advises clients, is how to navigate the government's use of a national security exception when it is entirely unclear what the nexus with national security is. And if there's time, Marcia may want to comment on that. But on the one hand, the government does need flexibility to deal with emerging threats. On the other hand, it is not good for the economy in the midst of a recovery from a pandemic, that private businesses are unable to govern their forward conduct in a reasonable and predictable fashion. How do you navigate or bridge those two solitudes? We're all working on that, and it's something that we help clients with each and every day, because we're able to give clients just a basic look inside the black box, which comes from years in government, and help people to understand what they're up against, which is often, as the old expression goes, not malice on the part of the government, but often inadvertence or desperation. And knowing where that's coming from tends to help clients a great deal.
Okay, and that segues into the other question, which was, what is your view on government relations strategies in the national security context What are the potential benefits, risks of addressing your concerns to individuals outside the actual procurement process? And is there a place or a way to get direct communication with politicians involved in the process?
So this is a really tough situation, but it is navigable if you get the right advice and you're careful about it. Most procurements have communication rules. In other words, if you're going to talk about the procurement, there are rules within the procurement documents that direct you on how you are to do that. But of course, that's within the procurement. There is so much that happens in advance of an RFI being launched, or an RFP or other procurement process, which tends to shape what that process will look like and what the government believes it needs and is looking for. It is a mistake, I think, not to be part of the shaping process. And I think most people in the defense and security world who are most successful are able to get ahead of things and help the government figure out what it needs, often by informing the government of what's available, what the marketplace can deliver, and what the marketplace wants to deliver, because this is so much a part of business success. Once the government has made a decision that it wants 3,000 widgets of a particular description, it is difficult to steer that ship in another direction. So much better to be part of shaping what kind of widgets the government needs or believes it needs prior to the issuance of documents. And that's where the government relations piece is so important. Some people do it very well, others do it poorly, and it really, I think, is underrated in terms of its value to ultimate profitability.
Okay, and the last question we had that came in was for Marcia. For the ITB requirement, does all of the work or opportunity for Canadian businesses have to be done under the contract that has the ITB requirement?
Thanks, Neil. Before I move into that, let's see here. Hi, I just want to check with my mic. Is it working, Neil?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm having telephone troubles today. I apologize. Just to follow up on a couple of comments before I dive into the answer on the ITBs, I want to emphasize that I strongly agree with Andrew with regard to his comments when he was chief of staff and he had to get the 3 pivot points coming towards him before, we're going to start opening up meetings and speaking with officials. Having been in justice, I was one of those 3 pivot points for Andrew. And I will tell you that if the issue started in the legal department, so if a bidder or a potential bidder was complaining with regard to a procurement and the approach to the procurement, that isn't going to necessarily be the trigger, as Andrew's identified. And the reason why is because when you're conducting a procurement and the business group is making a decision about the risk, a bidder may not like the way the procurement's going or may not like the way the government is determining what its requirements are, but that is a business decision. And so, as Andrew said, the other arms that have to come in, which is the media and the government relations activities, are incredibly important in that regard. And with regard to the national security exception, yes, as Andrew also indicated, national security is not defined. And where we talk about it in the context of procurement is that all of the trade agreements, as we mentioned, allow for a national security exception. However, my view of that is the words aren't the magic. It's not like you can say the magic abracadabra and now everything is protected. National security is actually a functional effort in a procurement. So it's looking at things like we've talked about in the 2 sessions: security protection, controlled goods program, protecting what's under regulation, what's coming into Canada from U.S. counterparts who are under the international traffic in arms regulations. It's the contract security program. It's assessing contractors and their contracting organization. It's determining whether we have individuals and companies who will work on government
projects who can be trusted, who've been vetted, and can see the secure and controlled information. And it's also, again, the supply chain integrity assessments. So it's, again, looking at what is the supply chain? Is it secure? Do we need a domestic source of supply? So indeed, we don't have time to get into it today, but federally, the Canadian government has adjusted the regulations with respect to the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. In my view, they've reduced access to the tribunal, because what they've said now in the regulations is that anytime a procurement is subject to a national security exception, the tribunal can't even hear the complaint. So prior to 2019, even if a procurement was subject to a national security exception, the tribunal would look at how that exception was invoked and determine whether there was a rational connection to the claim that the procuring authority didn't have to comply with their trade agreement obligations because of national security. And the government was not doing well at the CITT for several years prior to this regulatory change, because the CITT kept on repeating, they need to see a rational connection between the invocation of the NSC and the procurement itself. As I said, in 2019, the government shifted the regulations. I think it's questionable whether this regulation change is even enforceable in light of the legislation that the CIT is operating under. But they have sought to reduce access of suppliers to the CITT by invoking this change to the authority of the CITT. That loops back to Andrew's comment with regard to, do you have a good and solid government relations approach? Because if you're going to bid on a procurement and the national security exception has been invoked and you may not see the rationale behind it, it's important to raise those kinds of concerns and to seek validation from government actors as to what is the justification for this. So I just wanted to mention those 2 points. Now, with respect to our potential contractors, the ITB requirements don't have to be applied only on what I'll call a go-forward basis. So if you have a $250 million contract with an equivalent $250 million ITB, it doesn't have to be, that ITB commitment doesn't have to be executed in conjunction with the contract that you've executed. And this is a reasonable approach because contractors are constantly doing work in the Canadian economy, and they may be doing it under contracts that aren't subject to the ITB, but they're still contributing back to the Canadian economy. So the program does acknowledge that reality, and it will permit contractors to apply their past in Canada activities that align to the key industrial capabilities of that particular procurement, with one proviso: at least 30% of the transactions or the work that's being banked have to be products or services that are in Canada executed. So that's known as the Canadian content value. So the CCV of what you're trying to bank and save up for future ITB covered procurements has to be at least 30%.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions we had. So we just once again like to thank everybody for participating today. You have the contact information for all of the panelists included in the presentation. So if you do have any questions or follow-up matters, please feel free to reach out. And with that, thanks so much to everybody. Have a good day.